Just in terms of, let's do a little bit of follow-up. During the week, I got an email from Brother Bruce, and Brother Bruce was commenting on the supposed conflict we see in Exodus 33, where it says that God spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend, and then just a few verses later in the chapter, it says, "No man can see my face and live." And I agree with Brother Bruce. We have to resolve that kind of conflict. Let me.
This was Bruce Wade?
Yeah, Brother Bruce Wade from Southern New Hampshire. I guess he was joining us last week. So here's the verses we're talking about. Brother Bruce's suggestion was that this expression of seeing a man face to face, speaking to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend, is really idiomatic. It's a turn of phrase in a way, and it signifies the presence of God, being in God's presence, not literally seeing God's face. Just as an example, I've had many Zoom meetings with people at work who I've never met in person. I've seen their face on Zoom, and then one day they're in the office, and I say, "Oh, it's nice to finally meet you face to face." Well, I've seen their face before, but I've never been in their presence. And so that's the suggestion, is that Moses, in some sense, was very intimately in the presence of God when he stood in the tent of the congregation, the tent of meeting. But he wasn't actually seeing any physical face of God the way we might imagine seeing somebody else's face. So hopefully that helps folks with that conflict. Another interesting thing to support this is that the same word translated face in verse 11 and verse 21 and 23 appears in between. God said, "My presence will go with you and I will give you rest." In this case, the word face is translated as presence. So I think that gives a lot of credence to Brother Bruce's suggestion. Just wanted to share that with you all. Another comment I thought was interesting comes from the Robert Alter translation on this passage where God says, "You shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." Alter in his commentary says, "Volumes of theology have been spun out of these enigmatic words. Imagining the deity in frankly physical terms was entirely natural for the ancient monotheists. This God had, or at least could assume, a concrete manifestation which had front and rear, face and back, and that face man was forbidden to see. But such concreteness does not imply conceptual naivete. Through it, the Hebrew writer suggests an idea that makes good sense from later theological perspectives, that God's intrinsic nature is inaccessible and perhaps intolerable to the finite mind of man." I think this is kind of what we were saying last week. It's, if God revealed himself to us in his fullness, it'd be too much for us to take in. Something of his attributes, his goodness, what Alter calls the directional pitch of his ethical intentions, the afterglow of the effulgence of his presence can be glimpsed by humankind. It's some pretty flowery language to describe, something that's too much for us, but we just get a sense of who God is and how awesome he truly is. So I think that's kind of fascinating to think about. Let's see. So thank you, Brother Bruce, for sharing that thought. I found it quite helpful. Hopefully you all did as well. So we've been looking at this idea of man having been made in God's image and likeness, which comes from Genesis 1, verse 26. Trying to understand what exactly that means for us today. If we look at the context of Genesis, the next closest direct reference to this concept is in Genesis chapter 5. Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image and called his name Seth. So the Hebrew words for image and likeness used in Genesis 1:26, this is the only other verse in all of Scripture where they appear together. And if you look at the context, so I've got 27-28 from Genesis 1 on the left. I've got Genesis 5 on the right. So these are the only two places where image and likeness are used together. And you can see there's a lot of similarities in sort of the themes. There's 4 points that are reiterated in Genesis 5 that come from Genesis 1. One, that human was made in God's image and likeness. 2, that 2 genders were given. 3, that there was a blessing given to humankind. And finally, 4, a description of human flourishing with the instruction to be fruitful and multiply. In chapter 1, it's now being fulfilled in chapter 5 through Seth. So Adam had a son, his son had sons and daughters. They were in Adam's image, just as Adam was in God's image. If Adam's image and likeness after the fall was any different than it had been when he was created, this connection between verse 1 and verse 3 of Genesis chapter 5 wouldn't make sense. Right? So verse 1 here, reiterating that man was made in God's image, that's bringing us back to Genesis chapter 1. And so it's there to connect it with Adam's son Seth and the fact this image and likeness of God was being passed on to Adam's descendants. So the thought here is that man always had a mandate from God to image God's characteristics, right? We talked about, this is more than just God's appearance, the human form, the body, the head, the hand of God, the eyes of God. This is actually God's characteristics, to take it to a higher spiritual plane. So the idea is that through man, God's image and likeness would be propagated throughout his creation. And so now this is happening through Seth, right, the seed of the woman who is, essentially replacing Abel, who was murdered by his brother. So hopefully that makes sense. Any questions or comments on that? So this is one of only 3 places in the Old Testament where I can see this idea of image and likeness being directly referred back to. Yes?
The idea of seeing God face to face that you were bringing out there, I like your comments there. In Isaiah chapter 63, it refers back to the children of Israel in the wilderness, and you mentioned the presence there. It says in verse 9, "In all their affliction he was afflicted, in the angel of his presence." And so there's this tie-in there to what I've heard commentary on before. We have Michael the archangel. There's also an angel named Yahweh.
Right.
So the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and in his pity he redeemed them, and he bare them and carried them all the days of old. And so it would have been this idea that rather than seeing the face of God, it was the angel of his presence that he would have seen at that time, and that would have been not the full glory of God, but why Moses' face would have shined, and it would have been, that likeness in the angel of his presence. So that's another, just something to think about there.
Yeah, I think when the 3 men come to Abraham on the plains of Mamre, right, and 2 of them go on to Sodom, and one of them sticks behind and speaks, and that one that stays behind is called Yahweh, right? So, Yahweh appears as a man. It makes sense that that's an angel representing the name of God to Abram. I think that's kind of in alignment with the idea of the angel of God's presence. Same with the captain of the Lord's host in Joshua. Whose side are you on? Neither. I believe that the angel there, who we presume to be an angel, is also called Yahweh. So that's an interesting thought. Thanks, Jason. So let's see here. So the question I was kind of muddling over was, is there some sense in which the image of God was depleted after the fall? So let's take a look at that. This is a quotation from Brother John Thomas in Elpis Israel. Adam's mental capacity enabled him to comprehend and receive spiritual ideas, which moved him to veneration, hope, conscientiousness, the expression of his views, affections, and so forth. Seth was in the likeness as well as in the image of Adam, and in the same sense, they were both after the likeness of the Elohim. right? So this is Brother John Thomas's comment on Genesis 5. You know, Brother Thomas is connecting Seth's image and likeness back to God through his father, Adam. You know, in the book of Genesis, 17 times we have the expression that every living creature procreated after its own kind, right? 17 times we see that, the offspring of each type of animal in the animal kingdom looks or has some image and likeness, after its own kind. So man is after the divine kind, in a sense. And so for Seth to represent the image and likeness of his father, who bore the image and likeness of God, it's kind of passing on that likeness. That's the sense that I got here. And Brother Thomas seems to agree with that, that they were both after the likeness of Elohim. But Brother Thomas goes on to say this: though Adam was made in the image and after the likeness of the holy ones, the similitude has been so greatly marred that his posterity present but a faint representation of either. I have to admit, I was a little taken aback by reading this. So many others of the kind of the Judeo-Christian worldview have used man's creation in God's image as the fundamental basis for the sanctity of human life, basic human dignity, harmony between all types of mankind, that there's this essential thing that all human beings have that comes from God that sets them apart from the animal kingdom. And if you look at Genesis 1, 26 and 27, let us make man after our image and likeness, and God created man after his image. Those two phrases, in between it is sandwiched this mandate that mankind have dominion over God's creation. So the idea of man's dominion, his place in authority, elevated above the animal kingdom and the rest of creation, really is tied to this image-bearing quality in some respect. So to hear, that this authority was taken away, yes, we of course we affirm that, after the fall, there was a change in the way that things existed in creation. And for Brother Thomas, this also means that the image and likeness was reduced to a very great extent. So, I'm not taking any kind of position here. I just wanted to highlight that there's another way that this has been seen. More in popular culture, this idea that there is something from God in mankind. It's the basis for this book that kind of got me into the study, Made by Design and in God's Image. Our self-esteem ultimately rests in the belief that each one of us is made in the image and likeness of God. Another one from Martin Luther King: the image of God is universally shared in equal portions by all men. He wrote this just a year before his death, his assassination. Every human being has etched in his personality the indelible stamp of the Creator. The worth of an individual does not lie in the measure of his intellect, his racial origin, or his social position. Human worth lies in relatedness to God. An individual has value because he has value to God. I think we can talk about the extent to which mankind images God. I don't think any of these statements are incompatible with the sense that some of that image and likeness was lost in accordance with the fall. The point here really is that this is the common thing that all men and women have. Whether or not it's to the extent that it exists in the garden, I think probably not. I think Jesus, all of the New Testament teaching about Jesus Christ shows us that he was the one who perfectly represented his Father, and that mankind today just simply doesn't do it. But in mankind is the latent capacity to do such. The spiritual, the ability to receive spiritual things, the higher thought, the decision-making process, the kind of the independent will that God has given to each of us, and the responsibility that we have. The animal's kingdom does not have responsibility to one another the way that humankind does. So just a few kind of perspectives on this idea to mull over. Any comments or questions? A couple. I think Brother Chris first, and then Brother Steve.
Before we move too far from the subject of Seth, and perhaps to help us distinguish between likeness and image, that there could be two different points being made there. Seth being in the line of the seed of woman, and the sons of God, ultimately, and connecting that with Abel. And I think if we get to Abel's offering and the fact that it was done in spirit and truth, which was a representation and reflection of God's purpose and plan, might give us some inkling as the distinction between likeness and image, so that all man may be in his likeness, but not all worshiping in his image of what is true. So perhaps that is giving us that link of Seth versus Cain's line, where it's not saying that Cain is in the image of God. Will give us some idea as to what image is more about versus just likeness.
Thanks, Brother Chris.
The thing that came to my mind, Ben, was you had brought us to Genesis 5, where it talks about Adam having lived 130 years. He had a son in his own likeness. And you had also talked about the fall. And I think that when I think of the image and I think of the fall, Adam and Eve were given a choice. The choice was to obey godly thinking or to obey serpent-like thinking. And I think each one of us has that same choice. Whose image will we bear? Will we bear the image of God in our interactions with other humans, or will we be bearing the image of the serpent? And in the next chapter, Genesis chapter 6, I get a sense of that. Genesis chapter 6 begins, and it says, "When man began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them," and what I want to just bring out this idea that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. And I think the idea that I have in reading that is that you've got two classes of humans there. Those that are bearing the image of God, the sons of God. And you've got the other class, which is the daughters of men, which are bearing the image of the serpent. So I think that my takeaway is that we have the propensity to sin. We have the propensity to follow the image of the serpent, and to think serpent thoughts. And our desire is to do the opposite, to bear God's image in all our interactions, as Jesus did.
Yeah, that's so taking it from something that's a design characteristic to something that's a choice to bear God's image or not to bear the image of the serpent, I guess. I think that there's got to be something fundamental here, because God created man. Man didn't choose to be in God's image originally. When Seth was born, I'm sure in some way he looked like his father. As he developed and grew, maybe he took on some of his father's characteristics, things like that. Some of those things are not chosen, but when you take it to the higher spiritual plane and say, well, we do have a choice, a God-given choice to represent him, right? That's what Seth ultimately did choose. That's what Cain ultimately did not choose. That's what Jesus chose. That makes a lot of sense to me. Any other questions or comments?
Just along that same line, what Seth did inherit from his father was the propensity to sin.
Certainly.
Right? I think that was part of what he inherited.
Certainly.
Yeah.
But that's, Steve, would you agree that that's probably not what, when it says that Seth was, well, I think that's an interesting question, right? If verse 3 of Genesis 5 stood on its own and said that he fathered, Adam fathered the son in his likeness and his image, it would be clear, yes, this is the fallen image that Seth is inheriting. But because it's in the context of Genesis 5 verse 1, it seems to be passing along this image of God that was originally in Adam that then is passed on. I don't really have the answer here. I think we need to look at this from a larger frame. We have to acknowledge, Scripture does teach that man is fallen, that he has the propensity to sin, and how does that concept tie in with this image-bearing quality that was passed from God to Adam and Adam to Seth? In Brother John Thomas's terms, it was a very greatly marred image that was passed along. It was not the perfect image in which God had designed mankind. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think there is some sense in which man has some innate image-bearing quality. I would call it a latent capacity. It's the potential. And certainly when man behaves like the animals, he's disregarding that potential for development. And he's not imaging God in the fullness in which he was designed to do so. Brother Chris, you have another one.
Well, again, just to try and help distinguish the idea of image between the animal kingdom and the human capacity, no greater love hath any man than to lay down his life for his brother. Try to teach an animal to do that, okay? It's just not in them to have that capacity to self-sacrifice. So I think that's the capacity within man, that he can love like God. He has that capacity to imagine that and to try to pursue it. And it makes him different than the animal kingdom.
All right, so part of my approach is, when I do a study like this, is just to see what others have said, whether or not I agree. I still want to know what sort of thoughts have been shared on the subject, just to kind of orient myself, to get some perspective. This is these are deep waters. People have been discussing what exactly this means for a long time, and the fact of the matter is, you need to look at all of Scripture, but there aren't a lot of texts that speak directly to this idea of man imaging and bearing God's image and likeness in the Old Testament. I think when we get to the New Testament, we see Jesus as the express image of God. Sorry, keep losing this. And it becomes a little more clear. So we will get to those passages in the New Testament. But I wanted to just do a quick historical review. I'm not going to get into the habit of quoting Catholic theologians, but just for backgrounds, Augustine believed that man was created in the image and likeness, and he connected image and likeness with having the power of reason and understanding. Right? So this is not the most exalted sense in which man can be said to bear God's image and likeness, but he does connect it with man be distinguished from all irrational creatures. Won't spend a lot of time on this. Thomas Aquinas, a little more complex, a little more nuanced, said we can image God in three ways. Initially, in that man possesses a natural aptitude for understanding and loving God, which is common to all men. So he said this is something that's general, and clearly we've seen that's not always developed in mankind. So Aquinas said that, secondly, inasmuch as man actually and habitually knows and loves God, though imperfectly. So this is mankind that is enlightened and is moving towards God, moving towards Christ and his perfect image-bearing quality. And then finally, inasmuch as man knows and loves God perfectly, and this image consists in the likeness of glory. So in this theologian's mind, the idea was that there's some kind of base level in which man was created in God's image and likeness, but this needs to be developed to higher levels of understanding, both in the present, in the lives of a disciple, and then in the future, in the life of a glorified saint. So we'll just leave it at that. Luther had a very different kind of view of things. Luther said, since this image of God has been lost by sin, whereas Thomas says, so greatly marred, Luther says, completely lost. We can never fully attain to the knowledge of what it was. Memory, mind, and will we do most certainly possess, right? So remember that for Augustine and Aquinas, that was sort of the lowest level of the ladder, sort of that capacity man has for image bearing. We do most certainly possess those things, but they are wholly corrupted, most miserably weakened. Nay, that I can speak with no greater plainness, they are utterly leprous and unclean. So, as part of the Reformation, the Reformation Protestants made a big deal out of man's total depravity, they called it. Basically, man brings nothing to the table whatsoever. The process of salvation completely belongs to God. I think for us, we see this as more of a partnership where yes, absolutely God saves us by his grace, but we have a role in that salvation. We submit to it. We change our behaviors as a result of our calling. The Reformation guys, basically, they wanted to put man as low so that there could be nothing said that man is involved in his own salvation. So I think it was important for Martin Luther to say, this image of God is completely lost. We probably find ourselves, our theological position, somewhat in the middle of the Catholic and the Protestant theologians. Don't need to spend a lot of time on that. Let's see. I did want to talk a little bit about this idea of dehumanization. So, regardless of what we think about the image of God in man today, whether we believe it was completely lost, whether we believe that it was marred, so that it was taken away, we do have to acknowledge that there is some sense in which man as an image bearer is set above the animals. Whenever this has been denied throughout history, it's led to disastrous consequences. During the Holocaust, the Nazis referred to the Jews as rats. In the 1990s in Rwanda, the Hutus called the Tutsis cockroaches. The Serbs referred to the Bosnians as aliens, and indigenous people today are still sometimes referred to as savages. Now, when you take away that quality of man that sets him above the animals, there's nothing wrong with then exterminating that life. So let me just share this quote from a Nazi describes Jews to bacteria that cause syphilis. So are the Jews carriers of criminality. The Jew is the true opposite to a human being, the depraved member of subracial mixing. So comparing Jews to bacteria, describing Jews as subracial, the opposite of human, makes it very easy to justify killing them. This scholar wrote, we feel free to swat a fly or eat a carrot because it's only a fly, it's only a carrot. And therefore, its life doesn't matter. And Jews could be condemned to the furnaces of Treblinka because they were, after all, only Jews. Leon Mugesera, part of Rwanda's then ruling Hutu party, called the minority Tutsi population cockroaches. He said they should go back to Ethiopia, which was their historical homeland. And within 2 years of making this statement, 800,000 of the Rwandans, mostly Tutsis, died in a brutal genocide. 800,000 people died. If you start to think of your fellow man as a cockroach, his life doesn't have a lot of value. And so I mention this because there's a passage that I mentioned there's only 3 references to bearing image and likeness of God in the Old Testament. And one of them is in Genesis chapter 9. This is the last one. So we have Genesis 1, verse 26. We have Genesis 5, verse 1 through 3. And now we have Genesis 9. This is after the flood. Let me see here. Am I in the right place? Okay, so the floodwaters have abated. The ark has come to rest on Mount Ararat. In Genesis 9, verse 1, God reiterates the command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So remember, we saw that in Genesis 1 and Genesis 5, you have mankind's flourishing, the propagation of humankind as the way in which God's character is being passed on and expressed throughout creation. So now, basically, it's a start over, right? And it's just Noah and his family. And so they have to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So immediately it should sort of be putting us into a frame of mind of thinking about propagating God's image throughout the earth. So whether the image of God in man was depleted or marred by the fall, this verse shows God's original creation of man in his image. It remains sufficient for the prohibition of bloodshed. So they're supposed to fill the earth with life. And in verse 6 of chapter 9, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. So there is still some quality of mankind that's protected from bloodshed, on the basis of how he was designed. So that's it. All of the references to man's image bearing, bearing the likeness of God, they're all found in Genesis chapter 1, chapter 5, and chapter 9. If anybody knows anything elsewhere in the Old Testament, I'd really be interested to know about that, because I couldn't find anything. There's a lot of connections to the prohibition on graven images, which I do think is a connected concept. But in terms of man's image bearing, I couldn't find anything. So I think we'll probably wrap up in just a minute. There are two other direct references in the New Testament. James chapter 3, it's talking about the power of the tongue. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with the tongue we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. So, in some sense that's affirming that, yes, mankind is in God's likeness. And also 1 Corinthians 11, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. So we have to kind of hold these ideas in tension, that yes, man is fallen, the image of God is depleted. There's some sense in which we need to be elevated to perfectly represent God the way that Jesus did. We can think about Adam in the Garden of Eden, and everything was in harmony with God. Everything was perfect, and until they took the forbidden fruit, things were really good. That's the state that we want to be elevated to. We want to be better representations of God, not just in physical form, but in kind of the spiritual likeness. So yeah, we acknowledge that, but I think there's also some evidence that man continues to be in God's image in some sense, and maybe this is that latent sense that requires development. But the ability that man has to receive spiritual things, that's not like anything that the animal kingdom has, and it makes man special. It makes human life special. So a few thoughts to ponder. Next week, we're going to get into how Jesus was the express image of his Father, and look at some of the New Testament texts about this subject. So any questions or comments before we wrap? Brother Chris, and then Brother Gordon.
A lot to make up for. Sorry about that. But
Just a minute.
We are told that no man has ever seen God. We are told that he dwells in light unapproachable. Oh, thank you. All of the manifestations we have seen, the burning bush, the giving of the law on Sinai, what Jacob saw at the top of the ladder, those were angels. The angel that guided the children of Israel in the wilderness bore God's name. God manifested himself through his angels. That's the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you, Brother Gordon. I think that's very much in line with the the comment Brother Jason made about the angel of God's presence is sometimes called Yahweh. Yeah. Thank you. Brother Chris.
It's been just one other thing, and it just drives home the importance of this. So when we think of some of the distinct characteristics of the creation of man, it brings us right to marriage, that, again, the woman was taken out of the man, which was very different than the creation of all the rest of the animal kingdom two by two. And for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, again, reflecting the image of what God was going to do with his son and the ecclesia.
That's a very interesting distinction as well. Yeah.